This is a special treat for you folks. Our next speaker, Dr. Rita Cameron Wedding, is a professor of women's studies and ethnic studies at Sacramento State University in California. Dr. Cameron Wedding's curriculum, Implicit Bias, Impact on Decision-Making, has been used to train judges, public defenders, practitioners in child welfare, juvenile justice, law enforcement, and education in jurisdictions throughout the country since 2005. In 2012, Dr. Cameron Wedding was the recipient of the John C. Livingston Distinguished Faculty Lecture Award, the highest faculty honor awarded by Sacramento State University. Her most recent article on implicit bias, titled Implicit Bias, More Than Just a Few Bad Apples, was published in the Juvenile Justice Exchange in June of 2016. You can certainly read her full bio on our website, and I would like you to join me at this time and a warm welcome for Dr. Cameron Wedding.
Thank you. Okay, unlike my students, it takes me a second to find my time on my phone. They can do it in a second. But before I get started, I want to say thank you so much to the state of Washington for inviting me here today. This is such an honor. You see, I'm still playing with this phone. Well, somebody's got to give me time. You can just keep the time for me. So, good afternoon, Washington. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. I have been to Washington a couple of times now, and I've had an opportunity to have this conversation, which is kind of interesting, because sometimes when I show up places that don't, you know, my work deals with some topics that some people find a bit controversial and a bit, you know, sensitive and hard to have, but they keep asking me to come back. I am so impressed with that. So we only have a little time together today, so I'm going to move through a lot of material. But before I actually get into the meat of the work that I do, I want to ask you if you would be willing to participate in a pretest with me. Yes? Yes? Awesome. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself before I have you do the pretest. Years ago, I decided that I wanted to come up with a way to have a conversation about some of the most difficult issues of our time. Raise your hand, for example, if you think that having a conversation about race is still one of the most difficult conversations we can have in our society today. Raise your hand if you agree. So I asked this question all over the country. I think in the last 4 weeks I've been to 4 different states, whether I'm talking to law enforcement, to judges, child welfare professionals, or educators, it doesn't matter. Everybody has the same response. Everybody agrees it's still a hard conversation to have. But what we know to be true is that when we're talking about implicit bias, we're not just talking about race. We're also talking about gender. So today we're going to be talking about the intersectionality between gender and race. This conversation was really important to me because I think in the past we didn't quite have the tools we needed to have the conversation in a way that we weren't pointing the finger at each other. Nobody is going to want to participate in that kind of conversation where they feel like somebody is blaming them for something. I certainly won't. So I ran across this work on implicit bias that was developed by Harvard University. And it has been probably the most pivotal work on the issue of getting people to work together to inform their decision making. As a matter of fact, one of the researchers out of the Kirwan Institute suggested that understanding implicit bias is probably the best invention of the 21st century. So, with that, I want to invite you to participate in the pretest, and Cody's going to get us, oh, actually, I have the slide. Everything is so high-tech. I got it right here. There we go. But it requires that all of you are on your feet. On your feet, Washington. This is the best part. There you go.
See, I shouldn't have sat in the front, huh?
That's right. Good job, Washington. So I have to tell you this. One of my roles is I'm a faculty for the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges. So I train judges all over the country. Judges make the best dancers. However, they've got nothing on you today. So thank you so much for that. So thank you, Jody, for the MC, the wonderful comments that you made, because it really caused me to think about the role of apprenticeship in my work. Because there's so many things that, there's probably not one thing that there's nothing that implicit bias cannot influence. But one of the positive things that it can influence, the absence of it, is our ability to recognize our labor force and to have full utilization of the Washington labor force. Once we recognize that our biases can prevent us from seeing the value in individuals on the basis of their race, on the basis of their social class, their gender, their ability, as well as their age. I'm becoming a new advocate for age these days. The other end of the continuum. You know, once we recognize how our biases can prevent us from seeing potential, it's like, then we realize it's like we'll never have the thriving labor force that you talked about. Sometimes I look around my classroom, and I live in Sacramento, and I have Sacramento, California was once described as being one of the most diverse communities in the country. That was a couple of years ago. But just because we're diverse doesn't mean that we work together. It doesn't mean that we have full utilization of our workforce. My students in my classes are still disproportionately white, even though we are a very diverse community. Even though we are a Hispanic serving community, we still are lacking the presence of our Latino and African American students in particular. And what my students in the classroom don't realize is that the reason that they're not there, the reason that they're not in a college setting, or the reason that they haven't gone through an apprenticeship program and have a journeyman's card or have those opportunities, it's not because they don't want to be, but it's because things happen at earlier decision points that might keep them from getting into the pipeline of success. So hopefully my conversations today will assist you in understanding implicit bias and all of its ramifications, and give you some tips in terms of your role as employers, as educators, as counselors, as advisors, to help you become more successful, even more successful than you are, in bringing people into the pipeline and keeping them there. So let's start by looking at the one thing I wanted to talk about is, in fact, essentially I just talked about this, is that at every decision point there are biases. So I'm going to even show you some slides that talk about what goes on in preschools and how decisions that are made with preschool children can impact their outcomes. And of course, all the other categories you are well aware of. In this next slide, we're looking at the whole idea of workforce segregation. One of the things that we know is that, unfortunately, we still have a workforce that is gender segregated. There are many positions and jobs that are based on gender. Obviously, women are still overrepresented in clerical service professions, secretarial positions, and underrepresented in the trades, and particularly construction. Male-dominated occupations generally pay more than female-dominated occupations, but even when women are employed in male-dominated occupations, they often make less money. So in this one, we're looking at the idea of intersectionality. What we need to do is figure out how we can really reduce that pay gap. And when we look at the numbers, we see that African American women, for example, still only make 63 cents for every dollar that a white male makes, and Latinas 54%, Asian women 85%, Native American women 58%. The other thing that's interesting too about this data is that it impacts women with regard to whether or not they're married. Oftentimes, married women are making less money. Some of that, of course, may be attributed to the choices that they make for as a result of their child-rearing responsibilities. Older women make less money. So when we look at all the different categories, we see that it has an impact on the opportunity structure that people have. The other thing that I want to mention too is that we know that we have a gender segregated workforce in 2018 when we still have to acknowledge the fact that if we have a male who is a nurse, we call him what? A male nurse. And when we have a woman who is a police officer, we call her what? A woman, yeah, exactly. So as long as we're still doing that, we know that there is this expectation that there is one particular gender that should be, that is typically involved in that particular occupation. And the other thing too that I often ask my students, I teach, as you probably saw, I teach in women's studies and also ethnic studies. I was the chair of women's studies for 23 years. And I often ask my classes, which is largely women in my classes, how do you feel about the fact that your opportunity structure may have more to do or as much to do with your gender as opposed to your desire and your skills and your abilities? How does that feel to you? I mean, do you want to have an opportunity that is based on your ability, or do you want your opportunities to be driven and steered in the direction of your gender? And obviously, the question is, first of all, most of them hadn't thought about that. They thought that they were just picking their career choices because that's what they want to do. But if you go back, anybody in this room, if you really think back and think hard about your career choices that you have, we start developing and formulating those career choices when we're children. And even before we have a chance to be exposed to anything, people are telling us that you would make a good nurse, or you would make a good teacher, or you would make a good counselor. One of the things that's so critical for people in the audience who work in advising capacities, which many of you do in one way or another, I'm sure. If you work in an advising capacity, it's so much your responsibility to make sure that your own biases are not guiding people in a direction that has to do with their gender or their race or their age as opposed to their ability. What do you think? You know, I get students who come and they're like my age. And I admit, like I said, Jody, when it comes to retirement, I should be the person who wins the prize for having gone way past, you know, that retirement age. But when students come to me and they're so excited about their future, I get some students sometimes who are in their 50s, who are in their 60s, and they're like, yeah, I want to do this. I want to get this degree. And I'm sure in your case, you get people who are in different age categories who want to go on and get a different certificate, or they want to be involved in an apprenticeship program. I'm not sure if we should limit people's enthusiasm, because if we're talking about creating a broader and more diverse workforce, that means that everybody should have an opportunity to sit at the table. So, what do these forms of bias or discrimination, what does it look like? So nobody's saying to women, I mean, this is the 21st century, nobody's saying to women or people of color that you can't do something. It's not that direct, it's more indirect. It's how, you know, we're more likely to encourage them to go into female-dominated fields. That's what makes it harder for you to recruit them. Because there are a lot of biases that are associated with women who step outside of the female-dominated occupations. So, but unlike the historic forms of racism or discrimination where things were blatant, I mean, there were times when women didn't, I mean, obviously, if you go way back, didn't have the right to vote, or when women didn't have the right to have their own credit cards. We're not there. We're just in this period of time where we still have these gender expectations around the kind of work that people do. So it's not the blatant, incontrovertible acts of discrimination. So if we're talking about race, for example, we're not talking about things that are blatantly racist. We're talking about attitudes, behaviors, snubs, slights, intentional or unintentional. Let me give you an example that I have. And by the way, when I first started trying to come up with this framework for the work that I'm sharing with you today, I had to think about what these biases look like to me. You know, what does discrimination look like to me? And of course, it's not like I just woke up one day and realized that, you know, what discrimination looked like, but I had to put it in the context of implicit bias. So one of the things that was really very obvious was, in fact, sometimes I use a slide called "Lady, you can't afford to buy this purse." And that slide under microaggressions is designed to get people to think about, you know, some of the everyday stories that we hear all the time and the role that implicit bias might play in those. For example, the time that Oprah was in Switzerland and she was trying to buy a purse. How many of you all remember that story? So she's in Switzerland. So Oprah, who I like to describe as the richest woman on the planet, Oprah is the planet, right? And someone said to Oprah, the richest woman on the planet, that you can't afford to buy something. Yeah, I think that's a little crazy. This is what happened that day when she went in the store. That day she went in the store and she probably didn't have her entourage with her. Gail probably wasn't with her that day. She just looked like all the rest of us that day, you know, just like an everyday woman. But the salesperson looked at her, and Oprah was probably asking to look at a particular purse. It was probably an amazing $30,000 purse that was behind, you know, bulletproof glass and all that stuff. And they said to her, you can't afford to buy this. And on what basis do you imagine they made that assumption that she could not afford to buy the purse? The color for you all is so brave. Thank you. That I didn't have to work so hard for that. Sometimes when I'm working with judges, they even make me go, well, maybe it's because of what she had on. I'm like, no, okay. That's the purse was in the store to be purchased, right? So this is what I think happened. And so biases are every place. So the reason we don't recognize those microaggressions that I had that list on the board, the reason we don't recognize them is that they are every place. We are surrounded by microaggressions every day, and we only see them, often only see them if they're directly impacting us. So one day, you know, another example was when I was in Trader Joe's. This is my Trader Joe's story. I was in Trader Joe's, and this is a day that I was going to, looking for eggs because I was going to have a pancake cook-off with my son, who still thinks he makes better pancakes than me. So we're still fighting about that. Now he's a fully grown man. So I went, and as I was walking past, going towards the egg aisle, I saw this movement to my left, this activity to my left. And I looked over, and what I saw was a young man who happened to be a young white boy, adolescent, just tall, standing over a grocery cart, and there was inside the basket of the cart was a purse. And this is what he was doing with the strap of the purse. He was holding on to the purse like as though he thought somebody was about to come up and take the purse out of his hands. His upper body was like, la, 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 but his hands were clutching the purse. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that boy is clutching the purse for me. So I decided to go on and keep walking, go get the eggs. And I also at that point thought, once I got over there, I thought, I'm going to look back and see if he's still clutching. Because, you know, I am a social scientist. And as a social scientist, we like to check out our hypotheses. And we have to have at least three tests to see if it's real. So I looked back to see if he was clutching the purse. And there were people milling around the purse who happened to be white people, but he wasn't clutching the purse. I thought, that's interesting. So I did go back the second time just to see. And I'll be darned if that boy didn't clutch the purse again. So this is where the story gets interesting. So I said to my friend, the All-American Girl. How many of you have heard that term, All-American Girl? Okay. So Shayna, unless you want to have me stand here and fiddle with your phone, you've got messages, by the way. What are the characteristics of the All-American Girl? White, what? She's wearing a dress. Blonde hair, white, blue eyes, white. Okay, so, you know, this is what I want to say about you Washingtonians. You all are quick. You're not wasting any time. Every other audience I do this, they're like, oh, well, you are right in there. Okay, so blonde, white, blue-eyed, wearing a dress, pretty feminine, right? That kind of thing. Skinny, like a cheerleader type skinny. Okay. So I said I'll call her Mary, the All-American Girl. You can just give me hand signals or put numbers on paper. I said to Mary, who I'm calling the All-American Girl. So visualize Mary as the All-American Girl. We know her characteristics, right? So I was telling Mary, the All-American Girl, what I had experienced in Trader Joe's. Mary, the All-American Girl, said, Rita, never in a million years would I have ever thought he was clutching the purse for me. Right? Never in a million years. What do you think? Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense because Mary, the All-American Girl, when people see her coming, they're like, oh, All-American Girl, can you hold my little baby while I run to the bathroom? Stranger, hold my baby while I run to the bathroom. Okay, so it's a real different reaction. So this is what started happening. I started asking people all over the country, every group that I worked with, can you tell me the characteristics of the All-American Girl? And every place I went, I got the same answer. So once I was in South Carolina, I asked the same question. I said, every place I go, I get the same answer, same description of the All-American Girl. It is almost as though we have all taken a test called the All-American Girl. Or, you know, taken a class, it's almost like, how do we all know the answer? Did we all take a course called the All-American Girl? And one of the social workers in that group, she stood up and she said, we all know the answer because we take that course every day. Does that make sense? I mean, we take the course. So at the same time that we're taking the course of the All-American Girl every day, we're taking the course of other groups like myself, people who look like me, that are depicting me as somebody who is more likely to steal somebody's purse. Apparently somebody took that course because people will clutch their purses a lot. And by the way, I did tell Mary, the All-American Girl, I did want to go back the third time to really do a complete study, right? And she said, I'm glad you didn't because that time, by then, he would have thought you were stalking him. So I didn't. So just like we have these depictions of the All-American Girl, we also have depictions of other groups. And as a result of those depictions, we have these microaggressions. We also have these assumptions that they may not be good workers. We have these assumptions that, you know, that women may not be strong enough to do some of the jobs, that they may not be able to do the lifting, or they may have to be at home with their families, or whatever the assumptions might be. Each one of those stereotypes are bringing you farther and farther away from reaching your goal of having a thriving workforce. So women, for example, in male-dominated occupations are often considered less feminine. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that. Okay, there's assumptions that they're lesbians. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that. And by the way, by saying that, I am not suggesting that lesbians are bad. But I'm just saying that in culture, oftentimes to be called that is like an offense to a lot of people. And by the way, all these things are microaggressions, and this is how we keep people from being able to move into occupations that they might be perfectly suited for, but they don't want to take these jobs because they are afraid of what people will think about them. So what is implicit bias? Implicit bias basically means that there's something going on in my brain. Implicit bias, once Harvard started doing the research, what they realized is that if they put our brains in an MRI machine, our brains start to activate when we experience fear, threat, and anxiety, like spiders and snakes. Our brains actually do something when we experience those things. And so it's not just like a bad attitude. And I also want to say about implicit bias is that having implicit bias and implicit biases, it doesn't, oh, shucks, how do I do it back? Okay, thank you, Cody. It doesn't make us bad. Everybody has implicit. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person because I have them. As a professor, I have to be, the chair of women's studies. I'm always recruiting students. I'm just like you. Those of you who are, employers and you need to bring people in, or those of you who are running these internship programs, you need to bring people in. I want to bring people in. That's my job, is to get them there and to make sure I have good retention and to make sure that they have good outcomes and that they're successful, right? So what happens when I have somebody who comes to my office and they don't look like the type of person I want them to look like to be in my program? What happens when they come in and they have tattoos? I don't know about you, but I'm working on my biases about tattoos, but it's a work in progress. But one of my big biases has to do with this thing. Excuse my bag. When people forget where their belt should be, and their belt ends up down there. Did you all ever seen that? Anybody else have a kind of a little thing about that? Okay, so that's one of my biases. So the day that a student showed up and he had the tattoos, he had the belt below his, like way down there, the sagging pants. He had the dreadlocks, which from my work with law enforcement is considered, they use that as evidence of reasonable suspicion. And the new one, yes, yeah, you can find me you can Google me and you'll see me with dreadlocks too. So, but the other thing, this was a new one for me. He also had this new thing that I wasn't accustomed to, the grill. So imagine you, the apprenticeship coordinator, or you, the employer, or you, the college educator, or K through 12 educator, and now you have somebody who's in your class or who's coming up to you. They want to participate in the program you have, and this is what you give them. That's what implicit bias does. It's not like I said out loud, I don't like his grill, I don't like his tattoos. My brain automatically connects the dots with something that creates anxiety, fear, or a threat to me. And so once we start to deconstruct our implicit biases, we will be a lot more successful in achieving our diversity goals. This is a very brief clip on implicit bias that I show with judges. It's taken the Harvard Implicit Association test. Oh, great. A few of you have. Let me encourage all of you to take it. They offer tests on age, on gender, on race, many different categories that you can take online in your own time. I wanted to go back for a second with the student that I was referring to you, was speaking about, and my body language, and how my body language was a reflection of my own biases. And because I wanted to say that this is how we miss good people. As it turns out, this individual was an engineering major. He was a 4.0 student. And my lesson to myself is that I cannot judge the next best scholar by whether or not they sag their pants. What do you think? Yeah, the same, I mean, obviously the same, would apply to you. So again, this is the book by the Harvard Implicit Bias work. If you want to get more information about that, it's called Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. So, I wanted to share this. I'm going to give you a couple of slides that really focus on what you may not know about the students who don't make it to you. So there's a whole bunch of people who never get to you into the internship programs. They don't even make it out of high school. They don't sometimes even make it out of preschool because of the biases of well-meaning people just like me and just like you. And again, I need to stress that because I don't want you to think I'm describing people who are, hardcore racists. I'm not talking about, or hardcore sexist. I'm talking about the fact that all of us have been socialized. If you were raised in the United States, you were by and large socialized to make assumptions about people in terms of obviously their gender, but also in terms of their race or ethnicity. So when we look at this slide, the statement, they come in as students and leave as felons. So I was doing some work in Austin, Texas earlier this year. And one of the teachers said to me that, he was just very frustrated about the fact that he said, how many of my students come into my school and they come as students, and by the time they leave as felons. And I know it's hard to make that connection, but let me give you another piece that I just learned about this week. I was actually I guess it was Friday. I was in Indiana, and I was working with judges and law enforcement. And one of the judges came up to me afterwards, and she said, I am starting to see a pattern. This is like a juvenile justice audience. I'm starting to see a pattern, and the pattern is that so many of the kids who are getting school referrals to law enforcement, who are being referred to law enforcement, the referrals are based on resisting arrest. She said, resisting arrest. She says, and it's dawning on me that if there's no charge of an arrest, a justifiable cause for arresting someone, how are they now getting charged with resisting arrest? Do you get it? And this is the judge saying this to me, and she wants to talk to me more about it because she's like, so now it's up to her to figure out. She's got to throw this out. She said, there was no other charge except resisting arrest. Like he wasn't stealing, he wasn't he was having a heated conversation with his girlfriend, but they walked away, everything was fine. We know kids will be kids do things, we're talking about adolescence. But she said there was nothing else, there was no other charge. So what we're seeing more and more is that black children, for example, Latino kids often have similar experiences. The biggest concern, one of the big concerns that we have for Latino kids with regard to their involvement in the juvenile justice system is that as we talk about all these kids in the school to prison pipeline, for Latino kids, we're talking about the school to deportation pipeline, because any contact they have with law enforcement that is unnecessary can result in them being deported, particularly if they are not, if they do not have citizenship. So what we see here is that a legacy of our history of racial injustice marks that youth of color have the disparity of frequent stops, searches, violence that leads to higher rates of childhood suspension, expulsion, and arrests at school. So what we're seeing is that the disparities are because of the stereotypes that these individuals have, the stereotypes that they are, you know, more likely to be criminals, they're more likely to be thugs, they're more likely to be predators or super predators. It matches up. Our brains have been conditioned to see them like that. And as a result of that, people are making decisions that will push them, thrust them right into first the juvenile justice system and then later the criminal justice system. So look at this image. What do you think you're looking at? Fear, scared little girl. So does everybody see three people standing over the little girl? Okay. So there are three people standing over the little girl. This little girl, surrounded by three adults. What do you think is happening here? She's the wrong color. Somebody else? She's waiting for her parents. She's being separated from her parents. Anybody else? Any other guesses? She's being taken out of her classroom. So this is an educational environment. There are three police officers, you know, standing over her. She's being handcuffed. She's being arrested. So do you want to know how old she is? She's a 5-year-old baby girl. A 5-year-old baby girl. How many of you all have 5-year-olds in your family right now? So I want you to take a second and imagine your 5-year-old being arrested. So let me ask you this question. What do you imagine she must have done? What must she have? By the way, she didn't have a little baby like machete in her pinafore. She didn't have a weapon of any kind. So what do you imagine she must have done? Said something back to, I mean, let me finish that question. What would make sense to you? What would be a justifiable reason to arrest a 5-year-old baby girl? All right. So just so you know, her offense was she was having a tantrum. Have you ever seen a 5-year-old have a tantrum? So this is what we call selective decision making. So we make certain decisions for certain people and other decisions for others. I think by and large, if the majority of this room, the majority of us in this room today had been arrested at 5, I promise you, the majority of us in this room today, well, actually, we wouldn't be in this room today because it would have such a devastating impact on us at 5 to go through this. So the very first time I showed this picture, I was in a big room, very big room, just like this, with 300 social workers. I showed the picture to the social workers. These are decision makers in education, and they were very angry that I showed the picture. They were angry because, in fact, the child welfare director said Dr. Wedding didn't tell the whole story, that they arrested a 5-year-old. So, and Mary, the AllAmerican Girl, said, stop showing that picture, you're just making people mad. But this is what I'm thinking. I think people need to know. I think you need to know, so when you're making your decisions, you can go, I thought, you know, I did have this bias about this certain group of people because I thought all of them, look at them. I mean, if you're a decision maker in child welfare or something, and later you see this child being arrested at 5, wouldn't you just assume that that child had done something really bad? Wouldn't you just assume that their parents are incredibly negligent and all the bad things? It probably wouldn't occur to you that there is a difference in how we apply policies for one category than how we apply policies to another category. So in answer to the child welfare director, the judge who ended up handling this case ended up in one of my trainings. And I showed this picture. And she got my cell phone number from a so-called friend, and she called. So it's not, let me tell you, particularly when you're not a criminal and you get a call from a judge on your private cell phone, it's a little nerve-wracking. Because I was thinking I should have listened to Mary, the AllAmerican Girl. So I asked Judge Sullivan, I said, I just want to make sure, am I telling the story right? She said, absolutely. This child was being arrested. They didn't take her down to the police station, but it was an arrest, and it was based on a tantrum. And by the way, she was having an amazing tantrum. It was like levitation. The child was levitating. But we've all seen that before. And some of you are young enough to have remembered your own acts of levitation, right? All right, so Judge Sullivan told me that these things were happening so much that she was going to write a book. That's the book she wrote. She says, every week in my court, kids are charged as delinquents under criminal statutes. Ricky threw an egg in a moving vehicle, and he's charged with a felony for throwing a deadly missile. Alexia grabbed her friend's cell phone out of her hand at the bus stop and threw it in the grass. She, too, is charged with a felony robbery by sudden snatching. Now, she told me this on the cell phone call. It sounded so ludicrous in my brain that I was not going to repeat it until I actually had it documented in her book, and it's in her book. So I wanted you to have this so you would know. So I'm going to go on and talk about how bias at one decision point can be communicated and travel from one decision point to the next decision point to the next decision point. And the way that happens, the way that all of us are culpable or can be culpable is through the words we use and the words we choose. Everybody in this room has to read a report, write a report, use words, document something, write an evaluation, write some sort of recommendation, some sort of personnel file, right? Does that get everybody? Yeah, that's everybody. And so we have to be very, very careful about the language that we choose to use. So this slide on the right is a slide that some of you might remember from Hurricane Katrina. On the far right side, individuals are moving through the water. After all this time, I still don't quite remember what the caption says. But it says, residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. And those individuals they appear to be white. I don't know. They appear to be white. So they're residents who are finding bread and soda as a result of Hurricane Katrina. On the left side, that young man appears to be black or African American or black. I'm not sure which. Maybe both. I don't know. And it says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. So some people, again, this differential, the way that we apply words differently, is like this group, they're doing the same thing. They're finding bread and soda. What was the other word that was in the first caption? Residents. So they were finding and residents. And the second one, the young man, he's doing what? So if you see those words, are you going to have a different response? Isn't that going to drive your next decision? So if you get something on a piece of paper that's describing somebody that you have to make a decision on, and the words are showing up like that, the words in and of themselves, along with your own unconscious biases, can really inform and skew your perception. So a lot of people think, by the way, that they're just colorblind. I don't notice race. Many of us have been taught, particularly since the civil rights movement, that we shouldn't notice race, we shouldn't think about race, race doesn't matter. But even if we never mention race out loud, it still matters. And by the way, race doesn't have to be made explicit for us for it to get calculated into our decision making. So we use surnames, people's last names. We use the zip codes where they live. We use the housing projects, the neighborhoods. We make decisions about people based upon whether or not both of the parents are, the individuals are employed or whether they're on welfare. So we get information about people from many different sources and not simply from somebody putting their racial identity on a piece of paper. The other thing, too, I want to talk about stereotypes, and I've already talked a little bit about stereotypes. The whole purpose of me giving you the example of Mary, the All-American Girl, was to give you an example of how stereotypes work. So while Mary, the All-American Girl is a beneficiary of stereotypes. Other individuals, myself included, fall on the other end of that continuum. So even Timothy McVeigh is a beneficiary of stereotypes because of his race and gender category. And the thing that always strikes me as so interesting about the Harvard professor, FBI Most Wanted, it's like in our heads. And once again, I just want to stress, it doesn't mean that we're bad. It gets in my head too, and I know better, and I do this work every day. I wanted to point this out because as we're talking about gender, and as I said at the very beginning, it's so important that we recognize that there's an intersection between race and gender and social class. But when we're looking at race and gender, for example, it's like we have to recognize, and I always do this exercise at the beginning of the semester, and I ask my students to give me all the stereotypes they have about women, and it's a whole set of stereotypes about nurturing, supportive, you know, kind, stereotypes like that, the ones that I get for women. But when I get stereotypes about, when I ask them to break it down by ethnicity or race, the stereotypes for women change. And all of a sudden we get words like, these are not the words that my students give me, but this is the words from the research that basically says when decision makers are working with black girls, what they see are people who are, you know, they define them as being hypersexual or boisterous or aggressive or unscrupulous. When you are doing the work that you do, and you're looking at people to participate and be successful in apprenticeship programs, it's like sometimes it's like those characteristics that might be so different than the assumptions that we tend to value about women might cause these people to look really unfit and unqualified to go into a work environment and be successful. And so we have to be mindful that these are stereotypes and they don't define the person, but they can cause us to think that they're these people. Oh, sorry. Oh, good. I'm so glad that you're there, Cody, to help me. So again, language is powerful. So the next slide that I'm going to show, or video, is I'm going to show just a brief piece of it. This one is also about language, and I'm going to show just enough so that you can see how language that starts at one decision point can basically contaminate every subsequent decision point. Let me ask you this. How many of you have read a report or an evaluation or a letter of recommendation that uses ambiguous language? Raise your hand. So this is why it's so important. When the words are ambiguous, messy, you know, dirty, non-compliant, those are words in that particular discipline, but you have your own language. When the words are ambiguous, then that's where we as decision makers and people who are involved in this work, we fill in the blanks with what's in our heads. So the stereotypes that are in my head then allow me to fill in the blanks. And more often than that, so like if it's somebody that I feel really great about, you know, I have a positive, you know, assessment of, maybe the words that I will fill the blanks in with will be positive words. But ever so often, particularly when we're looking at issues of diversity and we're trying to recruit people, underrepresented populations who have historically not been had very high representation in the trades. It's like oftentimes it has to do, their marginalization from the work that you do often has a lot to do with the negative stereotypes about them. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to think about how language shows up. So also like in letters of recommendation, like for women, like in subtle but damaging ways, the letters for women were significantly weaker for men. And you probably don't even realize that. When I've talked to people who've worked in the trades, when I'm doing work with community colleges, a lot of the faculty in community colleges will say, or the chairs or the directors of programs that have to do with trades. They will say, you know what, I'm not really against women being in the trades, but I just don't think they can really do the work. And then one guy a couple of months ago, he says, I don't even know why I thought that. I just thought that. And so when they're getting these letters of recommendation that are somewhat weak, it kind of reinforces the biases that they already have. Another one is, I have the names for schools. That one has to do with the fact that there was a study that was done at UC Berkeley, and in the study, the teachers were basically asked to look at these reports of the students according to their names. And some of the reports had the names Darnell and Deshawn, which are stereotypically black names, or they had the names Greg or Jake on them. These were the same reports, The only difference in the reports is that the names were changed. So everybody was getting the same reports, but the people who got the reports with the name Darnell or Deshawn, they rated these students more often as troublemakers, and they anticipated that they would have problems in the future. So again, this is how our brain is taught to connect the dots. So even when you see the names, not the race on a piece of paper, but even the names can cause you to form biases about the people who you're having to make a decision about. Oh, that was it. So this is how bias plays out in the work that we do. And what I am hoping that you will be able to use this work to apply it to the decisions that you make every day. So how many, please raise your hand if there is one thing that you will be able to think about with regard to implicit bias that might inform your work. Please raise your hand.
I am biracial and a female and in my 40s, so this has been in my face my entire life.
Yes.
And, I just wonder, like, these things are so ingrained into us and so subtle at times that how do you really rage against the beast, so to speak? You know, because it's not, I mean, even to this day, there are snickers and comments, and I worked in customer service, and one lady said, oh, I want that colored girl in the black back to help me, and my coworkers are like, who's colored around here? But I mean, and I grew up in white middle-class America. My mom was white, my dad was black. So there's these assumptions. Okay, I can swim, I don't play sports, and I have no rhythm. So these are things that we're constantly battling against because somebody put them into our minds. And even in my job currently, we still battle against this male-female rage that's so subtle but so destructive. So
exactly.
I'm just wondering, what is it going to take? Do we just keep losing good talent because of this, or do we just keep, when does it stop, I guess?
Yeah.
And I don't know if there are any answers, but I would just encourage everyone to just look inside yourself, because if there's something about someone else that really irritates you, it's probably what you do to other people more so than anything else.
Interesting. Thank you very much. So I mean, obviously, you know, if I had the answer to that, I would be, yeah, exactly. No, she said Nobel Peace Prize, right. But what I do believe, what did you say? Exactly. But what I do believe is if everybody in this room, I really believe that if everybody in this room pays attention to their own implicit biases, and if we create a work environment where we can have the conversation and keep everybody at the table, you know, keep everybody engaged in the conversation at the table, I think we can get someplace. Because you're right, this stuff is so embedded in who it is, so embedded. It's almost like, you know, it's very hard to get people to really rethink their biases or to even acknowledge that they have biases. But I believe that, you know, I have worked on model site programs for judges all over the country. And if I can get judges to come to the conclusion that they have biases, and like one judge said to me, and we always think we're the smartest person in the room, if I can get them to rethink, you know, their biases, I think all of us can rethink our biases. So thank you for the question. How about somebody else?
Is it possible to have an implicit bias that's completely against your beliefs?
Can you give me an example? Oh, I think I know. Okay, go on. No, but go on and tell them.
No, you go ahead.
No, no, not me. You go ahead. And so what I think you're asking is if you consciously believe that we're all the same. Am I on the right track? So on a conscious level, you believe that we're all the same and that people are equal and that you want to be fair, right? So that, I think that defines most of us. So on a conscious level, we all, most of the people, maybe not all of you, but most of the people that I encounter want to do the right thing because fundamentally we believe in, equality. But we have been taught something that has been encoded in our DNA, just about. That's what we're fighting against. So whether we're talking about homosexuality, whether we're talking about religion, whether we're talking about gender and race and a woman's places in the home and all these rules about what women should do, it's like that's the stuff that we push against every day. So so one of the things that I try to teach myself to do is when I'm acting on an implicit bias, I try to make it salient. So implicit biases happen in a split second. It's when we say out loud what we believe, and we are thinking about it, we're conscious about it, we'll say the right thing. My unconscious biases will be a split-second decision that will cause me to kind of look at somebody sideways and make judgments about people. So that's a part of me that when I do that, I have to make it salient so that I can, what the research says is over time, I can decrease the likelihood that I will keep doing that. So when you have somebody who comes to you and they are applying for something or you have to make a decision about them, in any way, it's like the more you are aware of and cognizant of that first reaction, that first thought, this idea of who's the most qualified person for the job, it's like, yeah, on a conscious, the thing that most of us will say is like, well, everybody can be qualified for the job. But when we've lived in a culture in which 85% of just about all of the jobs, whether we're talking about being a police officer or a firefighter or politician or any of those jobs are held by men, our implicit bias is going to default to that. So yes, the answer to your question is yes. Our implicit biases can go against our personal beliefs, and they do all the time. Thank you for that question. How about somebody else?
Right here.
I have a question about cultural competency.
Yeah.
Because when you look at cultural competencies, a lot of our agencies will hire Asian police officers because it's the community they live in, or black police officers because the community they live in. So I'm asking, when are we going to get rid of that checkbox? And the reason I say that is because I am an Asian Pacific Islander. And it's on my dad's side. And if you look at my dad, he's that all-white American gentleman. You would never tell. But he checks that box that he is an Asian Pacific Islander, and they look at him funny. So if we're going beyond this, and you're talking about this bias, what about that culture competency?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is what I think. I think that diversity, when I am learning about diversity from my peers, I do better. But I'm going to say something about law enforcement culture, and I've trained a lot of law enforcement. I think that's a hard category to really, I'm not sure. The last training I did, I trained an entire police department last summer. And there were probably only a handful of African American officers in that group. Probably all 6 of them apologized to me as they walked out of the room for how I was being treated. I mean, probably all 6 of them whispered in my ear as they walked out of the room for how they were being treated, because they couldn't say it out loud. So I think that is a very interesting and precise kind of like thing about law enforcement that makes it hard for people it makes it hard for people to learn from people who are not from their same race, gender, or ethnic category. But in general, I think it is highly beneficial for us to have diversity, even regardless of where we're working. I think we should have diversity in all of these different populations and all these different communities. One of the things that helps is that when I'm talking to my peers, I'm learning something really different than I'm going to learn than when I'm working with somebody that I'm supervising. Because judges will often say, well, you know, people have biases against us too. Yes, I know that. But the worst place for a judge to learn about other people's biases or discrimination is from clients who don't have any power. But when you're working with people who have equal power to yourself, it's like you might learn something. So in answer to that question, it's a tough one. It's like we want to get rid of the boxes when it comes to ethnicity and diversity and gender, but look how far we are from being able to achieve those goals. We have disproportionality in every single one of our youth serving systems, every one, significant disproportionality, and the outcomes are dire. You know, the darker you are, Jennifer Eberhard talks about the fact that your skin color is almost a predictor to your outcomes when you're involved in the criminal or juvenile justice system. So the point is this. It's like, even though when Martin Luther King said, I dream that one day my 4 little children will be judged not by, but by the content of their character. His dream meant that one day he wants us to have a society where people are not only not judging people by that, but not treating people in disparate ways according to their race, gender, or social class, or religion, or any other category, including age, by the way. So thank you all very much. Thank you so much, Washington.